The night is thick with the scent of pine and gunpowder. It is May 2nd, 1863, and the air in the Virginia wilderness carries a strange, vibrating tension. A man rides forward into the suffocating darkness of the forest. He has just achieved the impossible. His men have erupted from the tree line like a thunderclap, shattering an entire Union corps in a matter of minutes. The enemy is in headlong flight. The tactical landscape has been rewritten in an hour. Most generals would pull back to stabilize their lines, to count the cost, to wait for the dawn. But he cannot stop. He pushes deeper into the blackness, desperate to find the next hinge point, the next weakness, the next strike. He is searching for the end of the enemy's line. His own sentries, nerves frayed by the chaos of the day, hear the hoofbeats approaching from the wrong direction. They do not see a legend. They see a target. They open fire. 3 bullets tear through the silence. Then, a crushing, absolute stillness descends upon the woods. To understand why that moment shattered a nation, you have to understand the man who rode into that dark. Because by every metric of the time, Thomas Jackson should have amounted to nothing, and yet he became the force that changed everything. His beginning was an erasure. Born in 1824 in Clarksburg, Virginia, he was a child of loss. His father dead by the time he was 2, his mother gone by 7. He was a ward of the state, essentially, raised by an uncle who had little time for a quiet, solemn boy and even less money to spare. His education was a jagged, erratic thing. He arrived at West Point in 1842, not as a groomed officer, but as a borderline case. He was underprepared. He was visibly, painfully nervous. From the first week, he was academically behind every other man in his class. This was not a story of natural genius. It was a story of a man who looked at the yawning chasm of his own inadequacy and decided that the only way across was through pure, agonizing repetition. He did not possess a fluid mind. He possessed a desperate one. When he failed to grasp a concept, he did not seek a new perspective. He simply doubled the intensity. He studied by the flicker of dying firelight. He walked the floor of his room for hours to fight off sleep. When the candles burned out, he read by the faint, heatless glow of coals. He graduated 17th in a class of 59, an unremarkable rank on paper, but a testament to a man who had pulled himself from the very bottom of the barrel through sheer, unadulterated force of will. He was not a man who took shortcuts. He was a man who built a foundation out of iron. The Mexican-American War provided the crucible. He watched artillery used not as a defensive tool, but as a blunt, aggressive instrument of force. He watched Winfield Scott move an army, and he internalized those logistics not as dry history, but as an absolute, immutable principle. He took that obsession into 10 years at the Virginia Military Institute. As a teacher of natural philosophy and artillery, his social presence was marked by an impenetrable, alienating formality. His lectures were rigid, dense, and delivered from memory with a haunting, repetitive precision. If a student dared to interrupt the rhythm with a question, Jackson would not answer. He would simply stop, reset, and start the entire lecture over from the beginning. His colleagues found him strange. His students mocked his rigidity. But inside those inflexible lectures was a systematic, terrifying understanding of what war looked like when the brakes were taken off. When the war finally arrived, that strangeness became a weapon. It manifested in 3 qualities that made him utterly unlike any other commander on either side. First was his secrecy. He shared nothing, not with his scouts, not with his brigade commanders, not even with his closest confidants. Richard Ewell, soldier of immense capability, famously described serving under Jackson as a state of organized bewilderment. He never knew if he was preparing for a decisive battle, a tactical retreat, or a quiet Sunday church service. To the outside observer, it looked like madness. To Jackson, it was a profound, cold calculation. He understood that the most dangerous intelligence leaks in any army do not come from the enemy, they come from within the officer corps. If they did not know the plan, they could not betray it. Then there was his speed. His infantry became the foot cavalry, a title they earned in blood and blistered feet. During the Valley Campaign alone, he pushed 17,000 men nearly 700 miles. They fought 5 major engagements, neutralized 60,000 Union troops, and did it all without ever needing a single decisive, bloody confrontation. He stripped his wagon trains and reduced the baggage of his officer corps to the absolute minimum, prioritizing mobility over the comforts of conventional command. He pushed his men past the point of conventional exhaustion, and then, with a glare that broke no argument, he pushed them again. The men cursed him, they straggled, but the ones who stayed, the ones who survived, understood that the speed bought them something money could not buy: surprise. Over and over again, against armies that held every material advantage, Jackson arrived when he was least expected. In the span of just 3 months, he neutralized 3 separate Union armies totaling 60,000 men without ever allowing himself to be pinned down or decisively engaged. And finally, there was his faith. He was a Calvinist of severe, uncompromising conviction. He did not believe in providence as a comforting metaphor. He believed that his movements were being directed by the hand of the divine. For any other general, the fog of war was a paralysis. They hesitated because they were calculating the arithmetic of life and death. For Jackson, hesitation was not caution, it was a form of disobedience. That framework allowed him to act with a terrifying, absolute certainty at the exact moment when other men were still paralyzed by the fear of being wrong. Yet his brilliance was not without its shadows, evidenced by his performance during the 7 days battles of 1862. He arrived late to multiple engagements, moving with a hesitation that appeared inexplicable given the mastery he had shown in the valley. This was a genuine limitation of his command style. He required absolute operational autonomy to function. When forced to synchronize his movements with the complex timelines of other generals, the very qualities that made him unstoppable in isolation became sources of friction. This history makes Robert E. Lee's decision at Chancellorsville to grant Jackson complete, unchecked freedom of action all the more significant. Robert E. Lee understood what no one else could see. He gave Jackson a latitude that defied military doctrine. At Chancellorsville, Lee did the unthinkable. He divided an already outnumbered army in the very face of the enemy. It looked like recklessness, it looked like suicide, but Lee knew the truth. He knew that Jackson's combination of speed, secrecy, and aggressive, faith-driven timing transformed a desperate gamble into a surgical strike. It was the peak of his power. When Jackson burst from those woods on May 2nd, the destruction of the Union's 11th Corps was so fast, so total, that it defied the logic of the battlefield. The tactical surprise was absolute, and that is why in the dark of that night he could not stop. He was a man who believed the opportunity was a gift, and to let it slip away was an offense against the mission. 3 bullets, 2 in the left arm, 1 in the right hand. The man who had pushed himself to the edge of human limits was finally pulled back. He arrived at the field hospital as a shadow of the man who had ordered the charge. His left arm was amputated at the shoulder the next morning. For a few days it seemed he might recover. Pneumonia took his life on May 10, 1863. When the news reached Lee, he did not offer a platitude. He offered a clinical assessment of his own survival. He said, "Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right." It was not sentiment. It was the truth. The Confederacy spent the next 6 weeks trying to replace a man who was in fact irreplaceable. A.P. Hill was brave, Ewell was competent, Early was aggressive, but none of them were Jackson. When the Gettysburg campaign began, the cost of that loss became clear. Ewell was tasked to take the heights south of town if he found it practicable, the exact kind of discretionary, fast-moving decision Jackson had made a dozen times without blinking. Ewell could not make the call. He hesitated for 40 minutes, and in those 40 minutes, the window of history closed. The heights were not taken. The war turned. Thomas Jackson was not a great general who happened to be strange. He was a strange man whose particular strangeness was the only thing that made him a great general. The obsession that made him a difficult student made him an unstoppable commander. The secrecy that frustrated his officers protected his armies from the rot of information decay. The faith that his colleagues found unsettling stripped away the hesitation that destroys men in the heat of battle. He was not replaceable because the combination was not reproducible. You could find brave men, you could find fast men, you could find men of faith. You could not find another man in whom all those volatile elements burned together the way they did in Thomas Jackson. When he fell, the Confederacy didn't just lose a general, it lost the only man who could make that particular alchemy work. The rest of the war was simply the long, slow process of the pieces falling apart.